I've assembled these notes here to tell people what it's actually like, what it's actually like to be under Russian control, whether that means, or communist control, whether that means you're in the commie America, and the commie America is then tied to China and Russia, or you're in, let's say, some other part of America that is supposed to be right-wing, but it's controlled by the Russians. You know, it's not a pleasant thing to experience, and most people have no idea what it would be like because they just do not know enough about the Cold War and even times before that. Now, so all throughout the Cold War, Eastern Germany was under Soviet, meaning Russian, control. In 1961, the border was closed, the wall was being built, and it became a major crime to attempt to flee to the West. Now, the other way around was not so much a problem. You could move from West to East, right? And because Eastern Germany was so close to the West, the government could be the government could not be overtly Stalinist to the highest degree because the whole world was watching. Okay, so that close to the West, you had to behave to a degree. You know, you needed to be more strategic in your tyranny, but life was still a nightmare under Russian control. You got along somewhat if you followed all the rules, and you didn't get unlucky, because if you stepped on the wrong toes, if somebody wanted your position or somebody wanted something from you, that was bad luck for you. And if you were a woman in Soviet Eastern Germany, if you were a woman, you had all kinds of problems, and nobody would come to save you. And you had to accept the standard of living. Everything was controlled. What you read, what music you listen to, everything was under surveillance. Even the slightest bit of activism could get you in serious trouble. That means a joke, reading a forbidden book. Your future was potentially ruined. So that means you could not go to university. You could not get a job that was nicer. You couldn't work for the government in any important fashion. You couldn't trust anybody. Soviet Eastern Germany had the highest rate of informants in recorded history. So your family members reported on you. And when the wall came down, people were allowed to access the files that the Stasi had on them. So imagine reading through the file they had on you and discovering that your wife, your husband, your brother, or your closest friend, or all of them, reported you. They all informed the government about your activities, and they knew about the microphones that were in your apartment or your house. They knew everything, right? And they had all these little tricks. They had all these little tricks to figure out who was talking to whom in Soviet Eastern Germany. They had this radioactive translucent spray, so they could spray an entire floor of a suspicious apartment, right? They would spray the floor, you couldn't see it, and then they would check the shoes of certain suspects. And if your shoe had this radioactive signature, they knew you were at that particular apartment, conspiring with somebody against the state. And there was also the use of highly radioactive needles. So they would take a radioactive needle and sort of thread it into your jacket, for example. And the radiation was so high, they could read it. They could read it with a Geiger counter from a distance. I think even from outside of that particular residence, from the street. So they would always know if you were close because they put a radioactive needle in your clothing. So this was life in Soviet Eastern Germany. Okay, it was not pleasant, not pleasant at all. And this was still the softer version of Russian control because, you know, everything was so close to the West, they couldn't do everything that they wanted or everything they could potentially do. Okay, so yeah, this was just in a nutshell the reality of Soviet Eastern Germany. Okay, it was really not pleasant, and you could try to follow all the rules, but something could come up. Somebody gets mad at you, somebody just doesn't like you, somebody who has more power than you, or you were a woman and you refuse somebody's advances. Your life is over. You could end up in a prison cell or in a psychiatric institution. Now, the first thing I have here is what I call the post-invasion cleanup. So imagine part of America comes under Russian control, or some place in Western Europe, or some place in the Latino world, anything. If an area comes under Russian control, you can expect what I call the post-invasion cleanup. This is how it's done. This is how the Russians always do it, and the Chinese as well. So first of all, Russia always has an arrest and kill list prepared, and they update these lists on a weekly basis, sometimes even more often. Okay, so they always look at the territory that they want to take over, and they know exactly what persons they want killed immediately and what persons they want arrested, because they think these people will become a problem. They will not be loyal to the new system. So you can expect embedded agents and special operators to kill specific people. Others are hunted and arrested. And even more people end up on a suspicious list. Okay, so if your loyalty is in question, you have dangerous skills, you will become disappointed with the new system, the Russians will have you on a list. Okay, so they don't care if you helped that revolution, if you helped Russia, if you liked Russia in the past. That doesn't matter. If they think you are a risk to them, they have you on a special list. And in case of unrest, they will come arrest you if your name is on that list. So there was the so-called Polish operation of the NKVD, Soviet Security Service, between 1937 and 1938. That was an anti-Polish mass ethnic cleansing operation of the NKVD carried out against Poles during the period of the Great Purge. Resulted in the sentencing of roughly 140,000 people and summary executions of 111,000 Poles living in or near the Soviet Union. And this was similar to other operations such as the Greek operation, the Finnish operation, Latvian operation, and Estonian operation. So this is a template, and they will use the same template anywhere. This is just the way they do it. And so in the years 1945 to 1947, about 500,000 Soviet soldiers were stationed in Poland, so right after the war. Between 1945 and 1948, some 150,000 Poles were imprisoned by the Soviet authorities, and many former Home Army members were apprehended and executed. So sometimes they kill you, sometimes they just keep you in prison and torture you and then shove you out and push you out on the street again. So people will see you, what has become of you, so everybody else gets scared. This is also something you can expect if you ever come under Russian control. And
yeah, there's a book, by the way, I should mention. It's called What to Do When the Russians Come. And it was written towards the end of the Cold War by Robert Conquest, who wrote The Harvest of Sorrow, of course, and John Manship White. And it has some interesting things about how they would do it, what you'd experience. And they gave these following bullet points. Apart from purely military destruction, the economy will be disrupted. Businesses producing anything except the barest necessities will, without exception, collapse. Oil will no longer be imported. Most domestic American oil will be earmarked for official use. That's if America is occupied. Nationalization of all major firms will take place. Small firms will face the same fate within a year or two. Personal savings will be wiped out by currency reforms. Grain, which has already been frequently in shortage, will be even harder to get a hold of. The Russians will take whatever foodstuffs they want, and food shortages will be rampant. And large amounts of engineering equipment will be stolen and taken and removed to Russia. So, and of course, this is in the occupied areas of Ukraine. I think they've already been experiencing this.
Exactly. And so the other standard operating procedure is the establishment of the new political elite. They call it the nomenklatura, or they used to call it that. So it's like managers, administrators, anybody that they need, and sometimes they will take Russians for these positions. Sometimes they will take local people whom they trust for those positions. So they expect you, as an American, for example, they expect you to support all these policies that you just mentioned, and also the roundups, the cleaning operations. And so those people who play along, those people who execute these orders, they will be promoted. They will be promoted over and over again, and sometimes even those guys will be cleansed, because for some reason the new government stops trusting them. Then military conscription. For example, in Poland, they soon had a standing army of 400,000 men. So you are forced or enticed to serve in the new military. Then some more mass arrests, 5,000 people here, 20,000 people there. And of course, Soviet-style planning will begin. So heavy industry or whatever they need, they will tell people to work in a specific factory. So you can no longer choose what career to pursue. They will give you maybe 3 options to pick from, or they will make the decision completely by themselves. So you will work in a factory making weapons or making other goods, and they will tell you how long your workday is and what you get paid for and what you can buy with your money. If there is any cash money, probably there won't be much cash money around. So you're under complete control by the system, and you cannot protest. So you cannot do activism. You cannot go on the web and start whining about conditions, because then secret police would pick you up. Then churches, the communists alienated many Poles by persecuting the Catholic Church. So they had certain plans to divide the Catholic movement, promote a communist, rule-friendly, collaborationist church. We also saw that in Soviet Eastern Germany. The father of the previous chancellor, Angela Merkel, her father, Mr. Kastner, he had the job of bringing the church under control. Not the Catholic Church, though, but it was the same template. So they knew they couldn't destroy the church overnight, but they did it incrementally, and that's how that went. Maybe I should mention the Katyn massacre. So Russia back then killed thousands of Polish officers and other officials. The Russians pretended to not know what happened to them and later blamed the Nazis for that. They brought these people to special places and special trains. These holes were dug, with heavy machinery. And then the Russians, they used the Russians used German pistols and even German ammunition. They used Gecko bullets. You can still buy Gecko bullets to this very day, by the way. I
didn't realize that they used German bullets. And it was 40,000 Polish officers captured at the end of the invasion of Poland. The Germans had invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and the Russians invaded on, I think it was the 11th of September. or no, it wasn't the 11th, it was the 18th. And so Poland got smashed from both sides, and a bunch of these officers, 40,000 of them, ended up in Russian hands. And the Russian, Stalin decided these were, officers are educated people, part of the intelligentsia. So Stalin wanted to eliminate them. So,
Yeah.
and of course, they tried to frame the Germans. And in World War II, it was convenient for the Allies to say that it was the Germans were responsible, even though the Germans found the bodies, found the massacre, and brought in the Red Cross to verify. This had happened during the time when the Soviets had taken over that part of Poland, and
Yeah, when
yeah,
but of course soon the Nazis and Nazis and the Soviets they had a falling out. So in June of 1941, Stalin wanted to create a new Polish army to fight the Nazis, but all these officers were dead. They were lying in these mass graves, and so these Polish officials desperately tried to find these officers. They were listed as missing, and they also kept asking the Russians, "Do you know where these people are?" And the Russians said, "No, we can't find them. They were there one moment, and poof, they were gone." And so that's when the Germans found these mass graves, and they try to make a big, PR stunt out of that.
Well, it created quite a crisis. I read a couple of years ago, the Maysky Diaries came out and was translated. Maysky was the Soviet ambassador to Great Britain and knew Churchill and all these other people. And of course, Churchill, wanting to be a faithful ally of Stalin and the Soviet Union, refused to believe the report that the Soviets had killed the 40,000 Polish officers. And of course, the Polish had a government in exile in London at the time, and they were, of course, greatly exercised over it. The fact that the Allies were allied with Stalin, and Churchill even went into a cabinet meeting intent on defending Moscow from this crime, and every one of his cabinet ministers sat there grimly. No, Winston. No, the Soviets did do this, and they said, we can't publicize it. We can't talk about it, but amongst ourselves, we have to admit this is what the Russians did. And even at Nuremberg, they allowed the Germans to be accused at Nuremberg of this massacre.
Interesting. Well, it took until 1989, for the truth to come out slowly. And so then fast forward to the year 2010, quite a few very high-ranking Polish officials, they died in a plane crash near Smolensk. They wanted to visit there to pay respect to the victims of the Katyn massacre.
Big commemoration of the event.
And so this plane exploded, crashed. We can't tell really for sure because the Russians they took over the investigation, violating international law.
Putin was in charge of the investigation. Prime Minister Putin.
Violating international law, not really handing over enough evidence, and not really handing over the bodies quickly and everything. So, this was such a shock back then. But this was 2010. This is when everybody still wanted to play nice with the Russians, so no big deal was made out of it. If the same thing happened today, we'd have World War III on the same day. But no, everybody tried to play this down in 2010. So Donald Tusk played it down. Angela Merkel played it down. Interestingly, both have sort of a interesting, weird Polish history. Now, there's been accusations against Donald Tusk. This is really murky. Angela Merkel, she grew up in the Soviet system, and she apparently really liked the Soviet system. Nobody could really explain why she became so successful in, German politics after reunification. Yeah, so this is how it's done. So you can expect the same in America. You can expect the same in any other place in the world that comes under Russian control. These post-takeover cleanup operations. And so then, obviously, for a while after takeover, the new system will control all media completely, and they will not allow any shred of activism. They will, they will allow some activism in some other media over time, but right after the takeover, the control is total. And then these new surveillance systems are being built, and once these new systems are in place, that's when they allow people to do things because they can find anybody who creates any trouble. And so people should be aware of the current state of Russian surveillance and also what they've done in the past, because their methods never truly changed. So we have data from Roskomnadzor, it's the government censorship organization there in Russia, and we have numbers for the year 2022. They received almost 300,000 tips from citizens about publishing illegal stuff on the internet or doing something else that was illegal, such as being against the war in Ukraine, being against the government, wanting change. This gets reported by citizens. So we have 300,000 reports. And this is when you're being watched on the subway, any train, any bus. If you have a certain patch on your jacket or your backpack, and this patch is suspicious, they will report you. They will shoot a photo of you with their cell phone, and then tell the government about you. So if you're a grandmother or if you're a teenager, if you're not really that dangerous, you get a fine. They will fine you. You will pay money, but it's on your record. So if you want to apply for a higher job, if you want to apply to university, if you want to move up in the system, this stuff is on your record. So if they pull up your file and you have several of these entries in your file, they will not trust you. So you don't have a career, basically. And also, this reporting system is just a hotbed of corruption. So, for example, if somebody doesn't like you, if you think somebody is corrupt, if you think somebody does something, this person can report you for something. Or somebody is an informant and is in it for the money, not for loyalty to the system. Somebody's just in it for the money. Somebody could frame you. Somebody could accuse you of something, and somebody makes a statement against you. This could happen even though you didn't even protest the government.
There's also something to be said in What to Do When the Russians Come. There's a part about organized crime and regular crime. You have, surprisingly, when the communists or when the Russians first take over an area, crime shoots up, because they're more or less looking at the honest citizens to see which ones are loyal and disloyal. So and they will actually incorporate local bandits if those bandits have the right political orientation, are very sophisticated politically. They can actually make them part of the administrative organization of the country. And then there's all these youth, because of so many children's parents are killed. There's a lot of wild young people on the loose committing crimes. So there'll be muggings and robberies and murders and so on. And the authorities aren't, they'll get to that, but they're not immediately concerned with that. It's kind of an interesting picture of how crime works under a Russian occupation.
Yeah, and as I mentioned before, back in those days, even in Soviet Eastern Germany, in those days, if you were a suspect and the government didn't really know yet if you were in contact with this person and that person, during the investigation, they could put a radioactive needle into your jacket, so they can check with a Geiger counter whether you're close or not. They could also contaminate a currency, paper currency. And so we have a lot of data now about the Stasi operations. So on average, a citizen per year gets about 4 millisievert of radioactive radiation. Okay, 4 millisievert is considered normal. A paper currency, a single bill that was contaminated on purpose to track it. One bill gave you 200 rem, that's 4 sievert. So you're supposed to be getting 4 millisievert per year, but this thing gives you 4 sievert. So they don't care if you get cancer from this. They just wanted to track you. So this is how they worked. And so they did this with paper documents as well. There was an engineer in Germany, an engineer who was under suspicion. And so the Stasi would make sure that this person received radioactive documents. And this guy then took those documents and gave them to a man from West Berlin. And so the radiation was so crazy on those papers, the Stasi noted in a report, we could track the radiation from outside of the building with a Geiger counter. So just so people are aware of how these people work. And so for quite a while, this was before, especially before 2022, the Ukrainian invasion, for years, we've heard these influencers talk about the situation in Russia and make it sound nicer than it was. We often heard the argument, as long as you don't agitate against the government, you can say whatever you want. You can hate gay people, you can hate foreigners, you can say this and you can say that, and you could, of course, say negative things about the West. As long as you didn't totally attack the government, in front of other people, as long as you didn't do any activism like that, you were perfectly fine. But that's not really true, because a lot of the time in Russia, over the last couple of years, a lot of the times these protests or this activism was not so much about revolution in Russia, toppling the government, aggressive type plans, but it was more like, why don't we have central heating? Why is the heating broken in the winter? Why do these hospitals not have running hot water? Why is the medical treatment so low quality? Why is this problem there? Why is that problem there? Oftentimes, these people just want problems fixed. They don't want to turn over the system. They just want a specific problem fixed. Or they want a certain candidate to run for office, local office, to maybe solve some of these problems. But even those people get hunted. And so they don't make much of a difference.
Yeah, one of the things that's in What to Do When the Russians Come is that the phone service will disintegrate. It will get progressively worse so that you can't reliably reach anybody by phone. And of course, when you do talk on the phone, you may be listened to. Right?
Yeah.
You're going to be listened to in real time.
And you need permission for anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the same thing with getting a car, and the cars break down. You're going to get awful cars, no regular service. People are going to have to do for themselves. And it's, in fact, one of the things they say, that people that are immediately caught in a communist country, middle-class people, they can easily fall into a depression in which they're not sure they want to go on living. Yeah. And of course, most people get past that, but that's how horrible you feel in yourself when you lose your freedom, when you lose your opportunity, and life becomes this slavery, this drudgery.
And for a while, people just retreated in Russia. Okay, so they accepted that newspapers were being shut down. They accepted that Gazprom would take over all these television stations. They accepted that mainstream media was under total control because they thought, well, we still have the internet. Then the SORM system was installed. So every internet service provider has these rooms and devices run by the FSB, so the FSB can listen into anything and they can read messages. And that's when people started to say, well, we still have VPNs and encrypted chat apps, Signal, WhatsApp. Okay, so they retreated so far that the only thing they had left was this encrypted type stuff on the internet. But when you have a system like SORM everywhere, they can do deep packet inspection. So they can do things that these systems look into these individual data packages, where they're going, where they're from, and you are automatically a suspect if you use these services. And also, at some point, you cannot even use these services any longer. Okay, so the only thing left to retreat to is sort of the old school tradecraft, right? Where you just share things on paper and you have dead drops, or you make like a chalk signal that looks inconspicuous, so somebody else sees the signal and they know there's a drop off at the dead drop. So you can use old school tradecraft. The problem is, in the big cities in Russia, there are these cameras everywhere, surveillance cameras, like hundreds of thousands of these things, so they can trail you while you go from place to place to meet somebody or pick up a message.
And by the way, this facial recognition technology now makes the surveillance state all the more powerful. When I worked in government, I saw this technology, and what it does is it will identify a face. The computer will, and it'll put like a box around your face, and it will look at your facial features. And if you're in the record, your name will come up.
Yeah,
it will identify you. And the Russians, so that's why the cameras everywhere is very important, because it's incredible, even the definition at a distance, it can identify people. And you can see where someone is or where they have been, which is terrifying, because it's a form of surveillance done by computers. And as AI gets more sophisticated, it means that somebody could just talk to, we talk to our phone now, Siri, but if you've got an Apple iPhone, but some intelligence official can go, tell me where so-and-so has gone today. Tell me what they've been. Who have they been with today? And it instantly comes up.
Yeah, and also they can do searches not only for an individual person, but they can ask the system, tell me or show me anybody who's behaving in a suspicious manner, because it's an algorithm. They surveil all kinds of normal people, so they figure out what's a normal behavioral pattern. Okay, this person wakes up, goes to work, stops for a coffee, comes back from work, or maybe goes to a store, gets home, sits in front of his television, or web-based internet television, so you can always trace and understand normal behavior. Now, once you deviate from that sort of behavior, the system can mark you as suspicious, and that's when physical human agents can start trailing you. Now, of course, having physical assets, that's expensive, but of course we know about the Soviet Union, how many domestic assets they had. They almost had too many KGB assets, and if you wanted to join the KGB, the goal was always to get a foreign posting, to be in London, to be in West Berlin, to be in Washington, because that's when you could enjoy life. You didn't have to live in Russia, and you could just make money on the side, right? But if you were a domestic KGB agent in Russia, you would just hunt these average dissidents, or you would just chase some foreigners, and just follow them around everywhere. This was not a well-paid job necessarily if you worked for the KGB within Russia. Okay. Some people believe that you can always evade with these technological options and these apps and these devices, but you can embed this stuff so deeply that there's literally no way to escape. the digital surveillance. And if you know traditional spycraft, you could try that. But yeah, the Russians they wrote a few pages of the special, traditional spycraft playbook. So you are battling experts. And if you're not an expert and you're battling experts who have a lot of resources, you will eventually lose, okay? And also, if you want to talk to people, if you want to work with people, how do you know these people are not informants? You think your buddy will go to prison instead of selling you out? Okay, and imagine if this Russian occupation goes on for 10 years and 20 years, at some point, people get fatigued. They don't want to rebel. They just want to go along, and they will report on anybody, virtually.
Yeah, we talked about the death lists in Suvorov's information about West Germany having 600,000, which is about 1% of the population. But in the wider levels of arrests, in What to Do When the Russians Come, they talk about 25% of the population of the United States would end up in camps if there was this kind of, and I think that would be true for any given country if you go to Europe or Canada or anywhere else. And so here's a list they compiled of the people that the Russians typically arrest when they take control of a territory. All former officials of the state, the army, and the judiciary, all former registered members of non-communist political parties. In America, in that case, it would not include the Democratic Party. All active members of student organizations, members of the National Guard, refugees from Russia, representatives of foreign firms, employees and former employees of foreign legations, firms, and companies, the clergy, people in contact with foreign countries, including philatelists, people who collect stamps, and espantorists, the people who believe in this language they invented for universal use around the world, landowners, merchant bankers, business people, owners of hotels and restaurants, shopkeepers, and former Red Cross officials. So those would be the top people on the list to be arrested.
Yeah, and of course they take your stuff. They take your car, they take your house. So you live, if you're lucky, you get to live in a crappy apartment. But Sergey and Igor will get your house if you have one or had one. And yeah, so if we talk about and also one more point I wanted to add to this is some people may say, well, if I cooperate with the system and they really like me, then I don't have anything to worry about. I get rewarded if I work for the new system. Well, here's the catch. You still have memories of the past. You know what America used to be. So, and the Russians don't like that. So eventually they might target you for no good reason, because that's what happened in the Soviet Union over and over again. They don't fully trust you. They would rather take the next guy, the younger guy, and just destroy you, and have the younger guy who's completely fully indoctrinated. So this younger guy takes your position because this younger guy doesn't have memories of what it was like before. He doesn't know what America really was like. So the younger guy doesn't have that sense of disappointment and that sense of resentment, right? Because, what would be a risk to the Russians if they teach you things, if they give you a position, why would they do that for a longer time? They can just replace you because it's safer for the Russian system. So cooperating doesn't necessarily protect you. Just so people understand that. Now let's talk about prisons and mental institutions. So the Stasi, for example, would grab you off the street or at night. Sometimes they would even indicate beforehand that they are going to grab you. So you live in this constant terror. You don't know what's going to happen to you, your family. Will your kids end up in a horrible, institution?
Yeah, they favor night arrests. They favor banging down your door in the middle of the night. And there's a specific reason for that. The people, when they're woken up in a groggy state, aren't necessarily able to think very carefully about what to do and how to defend themselves.
Yeah. And so the next stage would be they will put you in a holding cell. A holding cell by yourself for weeks in isolation, and they will expect you to just sit there in silence day after day. No sensory input. You cannot talk to anybody. You don't know what the charges are, what they charge you with. You don't get to see a lawyer. You cannot contact your family. You don't get to watch television. You don't get to read newspapers. Nothing. You are completely out of this world. And so after a couple of weeks, you are already pretty much insane.
And they will use torture. For example,
Yeah.
they'll use sleep deprivation. They've got this thing where they take a bed frame, a metal bed frame, they handcuff you to it, they make you lie on it, and then they run electricity through it. So they shock you.
They have
another one, I think it's called the elephant, where they put a gas mask on you and they fill the gas mask with tear gas. Yeah. That's another form of torture.
There are different stages and levels of this. Now I mentioned these Stasi examples because they had to be more careful with all of that, because there was always the risk that information would leak from, Soviet Eastern Germany to the West. So they were not using the fullest extent of their capabilities. They were not using all of it in that particular country. But of course, in other regions, when there was no chance of things ever leaking, they would devise any sort of torture method you could possibly think of. Now, so after weeks of isolation and or various forms of torture, the endless interrogation sessions begin. So in Soviet Russia, they could just beat you with a rubber hose until you sign a confession. In Germany, it was a bit more elegant, but still, brutal and crazy. And then you sign a confession, you get a sham court date where your lawyer, government-appointed lawyer, has nothing really to say. He can make a small appeal and say a bunch of stuff, but it has no meaning whatsoever. The moment you are indicted in a Russian-controlled system, conviction is pretty much guaranteed. I think nowadays the Russians have a 99% conviction rate. Okay? And so, yeah, you get a sentence in front of a sham court, and then you get either executed, or you go to prison, or in a hard labor camp, or a psychiatric institution. Now, I wanted to mention this. According to Karl Marx, different classes of people had different structures in their minds. So Marx declared the bourgeoisie to be mentally defective because they were inherently unable to comprehend Marx's theories. Since they were, in a sense, insane, there was no valid reason for communists to waste time arguing with these people. It was called psychopathological mechanisms of dissent. The anti-Soviet political behavior of some individuals were defined as criminal acts, symptoms of mental illness, and susceptible of a ready-made diagnosis. We call it sluggish schizophrenia. Andropov was in charge of the deployment of psychiatric repression from the moment he was appointed to head the KGB, became KGB chairman in 1967. Okay, so these are the options that these people have. So they can sentence you to 30 days in a mental institution, and they will medically torture you and use other forms of torture, and then they
use drugs.
Yeah, they use drugs, and then they shove you out on the street, so you are a warning to others, and you will never misbehave ever again. So again, there's different methods to use here. I have a study here. It's called Psychiatry as a Tool for Coercion in post-Soviet countries, okay, not Soviet era, post-Soviet era. And it says here, in some of the former Soviet republics, notably in the Russian Federation and most of the Central Asian republics, the old nomenklatura maintained its power base, effectively keeping post-Soviet psychiatry under their control and free from Western influence. When, after the assumption of Vladimir Putin to power in the year 2000 or 99, the political climate in the Russian Federation started to deteriorate, local officials felt it was possible again to revert to old mechanisms of subduing bothersome citizens by scaring them off with the psychiatric threat.
Yeah, in fact, I knew a woman who knew things about the apartment bombings back in 1999 in September, and she was actually made the mistake of saying some things on the internet. And they were trying to put her in a psychiatric institution. She had to flee Russia. She had to get out of the country because they were going to institutionalize her.
Yeah. It says, the key issue is that the reform movement in mental health had only a limited impact and did not manage to alter the situation in mental health fundamentally. Many of the mental health institutions remained inhuman environments and places where many human rights abuses were a daily occurrence, while the level of psychiatric care was far from acceptable. In St. Petersburg, Ivan Ivanikov, who lectured for 38 years at the State University of Economics and Finance, found himself wrestled to the ground, handcuffed, and dragged to the city psychiatric hospital in December of 2003 after a protracted dispute with a well-connected contractor over repairs to his apartment. An influential state psychiatrist signed the recommendation for commitment without ever having met Ivanikov, deciding that his multiple legal complaints against the contractor constituted an obsession with revenge. He was released after 60 days. So imagine, you want to comply with the system, the new rule. You want to, just not rebel against the system, but then you have a dispute about something. But this person has connections. You make some Russian guy angry and you find yourself in a mental institution. In the fall of 2005, a human rights activist from Cheboksary, Albert Vasilyevich Imendayev, decided to run for the legislature. He was required to appear at the local election commission to finalize his candidacy, when an investigator from the prosecutor's office met him at the courthouse with 3 police officers. They kept him locked up until a judge could be found to sign the order committing him for a psychiatric evaluation. He was sent straight to the psychiatric hospital. By the time he was released 9 days later, the election filing deadline has passed and he was out of the race. Imendayev's, quote, act of insanity had been filing a series of legal complaints against local officials, police, prosecutors, and judges, alleging corruption, violation of court procedures, and cronyism. The prosecutor, a frequent target of Imendayev's complaints, called his behavior paranoia. Now, of course, in any such system, they will publicly say it's possible to complain, it's possible, we have rule of law, we have a constitution that guarantees you all these rights, so of course you can complain, but the moment you complain, this is what happens to you.
Yeah, you get into trouble there. It's like the Let a Thousand Flowers Blossom in communist China. And this is what the fellow who wrote Bitter Winds wrote. He was a college student. He thought he was allowed to protest because they said, now we're going to let you criticize the Communist Party. And guess what? All the people they criticized the Communist Party, their names were written down and they were arrested later.
Yeah.
And that's how it worked.
Yeah, and this was apparently even a mechanism under the Russian czars, where sometimes they would pretend to loosen up, so they would embolden the dissidents, and then they could watch, okay, who of the dissidents is really going to do something, and that's when more repressions happen, and then they can loosen up a bit and see who's doing something, and then repeat that cycle over and over. In another case, in Cheboksary, a 4-term opposition deputy in the regional parliament, Igor Molyakov spent 6 months in jail on libel charges in 2004. While incarcerated, he was sent for psychiatric hospitalization after a judge agreed with government lawyers that Molyakov's repeated writings about corruption among local authorities reflected an outlook so somber that it might constitute a mental disorder. Again, this is post-Soviet. This was 2004, okay? This is not 1964 or something. It just goes on and on. In the same period, Natalia Kuznetsova was dismissed from a position at the audit office of the Russian Federation after she openly asserted that in 2001 and 2002, some 140 million US dollars were stolen from the state budget. Again, she's not calling for a revolution and a violent overthrow. She's just saying this money is being stolen. A state psychologist issued a statement that she was suffering from mental health problems. When finally they dismissed me from my job, she stated they threatened to call an ambulance to take me immediately to a psychiatric hospital for forced treatment. Next, August 2012, it appeared that in the case of Pussy Riot, this was these weirdo activists with their masks.
They desecrated something in a church and then got sent to jail in Siberia for a weird
dance in the church. The defendants had all been examined psychiatrically by psychiatrists from the psychiatric hospital outside Moscow, an institution that in Soviet times was heavily implicated in the political abuse of psychiatry. And of course, it's not a fun place to grow up. I mean, you can rightfully complain, about desecrating churches, but what kind of life did these young women, what kind of life did they have? What made them the way they are, right? According to the psychological and psychiatric report, the 3 women suffered from personality disorders and thus should be isolated from society. The experts did not appear in court, could not be questioned by the defense. The language used in the report sounded very similar to the qualifications used in Soviet times when diagnosing dissidents. Some victims emerged from psychiatric hospital physically permanently damaged, others were mentally destroyed. And of course, we should also mention the use of provocateurs, by Russian intelligence. They can do that everywhere. So they will encourage you to do this, and then the next thing, and then the next thing, and then they arrest every one of you. Yeah. Some people died in these psychiatric hospitals. And it says the violation of psychiatric patients' rights in Ukraine years ago is in most cases caused by opportunistic material reasons. Apartments, houses, and other property of psychiatric patients are taken away by relatives or by organized criminal groups that have the legal status of commercial enterprises and stand in direct contact with local authorities and police precincts. So they just take your stuff. Unfortunately, some lawyers and psychiatrists also participate in these illegal activities. Now, if you don't end up in a psychiatric institution, if it's just a, quote, normal prison, things can still be very, very crazy. Now, this was a fairly recent leak. This was posted on gulagu.net. This was reported in the Moscow Times and many other publications. So there were thousands of video clips stolen from Russian prisons. And so you could see on these video files abuse of prisoners, torture of prisoners, and extortion. So, for example, they will force you to sign a confession that makes no sense. They will force you to implicate somebody else that is innocent. And they will extort money out of your relatives. If they don't pay up, you get tortured in prison, or they prolong your prison sentence, actually. And there's also some indications that sometimes these prisons actually rent you out to sadistic people who will pay tens of thousands of dollars to torture somebody. You, in that case. So just some sadist who wants to torture somebody, and he gets to pay a prison to do so. And the prison guards, these prison people, they get the money. They make $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 from one
You
such
know,
deal.
I should add, people thought the Gulag ended with the Soviet Union, and it's simply not true. Abraham Shifrin, who wrote the guidebook, he was a Soviet defense official who defected to Israel. He wrote the guidebook to camps. I think that's what it's called, the guidebook to camps and prisons in the Soviet Union. Years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he gave an interview to Christopher Story in which he said, "Look, the camp system is operating like it has always operated. It is still functioning. It's been hidden. They've hidden it in places." And I met a businessman who worked to create the ATM machines across Kazakhstan, where they mine the titanium for the Russian submarines, and and of course they had the workers there. And I did this interview with him some years ago, and he said that he was in Alma Ata and he heard about that there was this gulag in this giant series of buildings on one side of town. And he thought, I'm going to go and check it out. And he got a chauffeur to drive him there. He went up to the building and knocked, and he almost got arrested for doing this. But he did see that it was actually a prison, but it was hidden. And of course, it was
Yeah.
run by Russians in Kazakhstan. You had I met the guy that was in the European Parliament. They had all the different countries in the European Parliament had lists of political prisoners because there were people who had fled the Soviet Union and all these countries, and they had relatives that were people they knew that were in the Gulag. After the fall of the Soviet Union, this delegation from NATO went to Moscow to see the freeing of the political prisoners. I forget what year it was, 90 or 91. And it was John de la Brown, who was also a member of parliament. And what he told me was they went to Moscow, they get entertained, and they're waiting to go and see these prisoners liberated. Day after day passes. Now, all the Western newspapers had announced their trip, had announced these prisoners were being freed. It was a done deal. But they get there, and then they said to the Russian officials, "What's the big deal?" "Oh, there's a hang-up. There's a problem with the airplanes. There's a problem with this or that." And eventually, after a week, these people had to go back home. And nothing happened. The release of all these names didn't happen. And when people went to the newspapers, like John de la Brown would say, like, this didn't happen, the newspapers were like, no, we're not going to go there. We're not going to talk about that.